Hey everyone, Tony D with another Screenwriter Fix. Back in the house because not sure if it's raining and there's neighbor noise um, but anyhow, today's Screenwriter Fix, the Universal Monster movies. Now they tried to do this and it was such a disaster apparently with The Mummy. I don't think the Universal people really understood how to roll out the movie. I think in the case of The Mummy, if you wanted to make The Mummy, you need the famous actor to be The Mummy. I mean, what you have to understand about the original Universal Monster movies is Boris Karloff was the star. And he was Frankenstein. He was the Mummy. Lon Chaney was the Wolfman, and Bela Lugosi was Dracula. And they were very popular. These movies were insanely popular for their time. So they had sequels, and they kind of launched them all on their own. And I was a huge fan of them. I used to watch them on Creature Double Feature back in the day on television. And I even had the Monopoly game based on the Universal Monster movies, which is a great game if you've never played it, if you could find it on eBay or whatever. King Kong is Boardwalk and so on. But, the tie-ins that Universal did were mostly sequels, right? So it was Frankenstein, and then Bride of Frankenstein, which I believe picks up, I think that's the one that picks up with, after they corner Frankenstein in the windmill and burn it down with him in it, the Frankenstein monster, I should say. And Frankenstein, the scientist, is dead by this time. The second movie starts with the Frankenstein monster like crawling out of the foundation of the windmill, which is very funny, and it just picks up with his son, I think, who's also become a doctor and yada yada yada. The curse of Frankenstein, and then, the Bride of Frankenstein, which ends with the monster getting a little smarter and getting a few lines, which is actually very creepy. I think Bride of Frankenstein's probably the best one because it has such a very strong ending. If you've never seen the Bride of Frankenstein, the original, it's really good, in my view. Now it's a 40s movie, so there are a lot of lags and people like smoking cigarettes and talking over drinks and taking forever to get to the damn point. But, the intense scenes are pretty intense for their time. I forget what came next, but eventually, after the Wolfman, there was the Wolfman, I think the Wolfman versus Frankenstein, I want to say, where they fight in the castle, and then to destroy both monsters, the villagers, spoilers ahead, by the way, in case you didn't know it. The villagers, these are very old movies, so I don't feel bad about spoiling them. But the villagers blow up a dam, and the dam rushes over and knocks over the castle. And then the next movie, which I believe is Abbott and Costello versus Dracula, Wolfman, Frankenstein, and is the Mummy in that one? I forget. So that starts, they find the Wolfman frozen in ice, and they thaw him out, and then he turns back into a human, and, so there's stuff like that. So they played around with the idea of this, Wolfman who couldn't die except under very specific circumstances, silver bullet. The Frankenstein monster was kind of like the Michael Myers of his day. Like, he kind of just couldn't kill Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster, he just, he would just come back to life. And in fact, one of the movies ends with the monster walking into the tar pits with that current incarnation, Frankenstein and Igor, It might have been the Abbott and Costello movie, I forget. And then the next movie starts with them finding the monster, but he's got two skeletons under his arm. So it was this great tie-ins at the old Universal monster movies, how they started and stopped. And that is what was very appealing to those audiences, just like the Marvel movies. Now, they tried to do this with The Mummy, but see, they assumed everybody would love The Mummy. They just assumed they had a mega hit on their hands, The Mummy would be the big launch, and yada, yada, yada. Not a good assumption. The problem with the Universal monster movies is they're very dated, in terms of monsters. They're not scary, obviously. They're fun. They were a little bit of a scare. For their time, they were scary. And Bride of Frankenstein does have a very grim line at the end, which I love. But for the most part, it's, fairly uplifting. They're kind of uplifting in their own weird way. So, how do you compare a character like Frankenstein, even though he drops a little girl down a well, to, the current crop of monsters like, Freddy Krueger, who butchers people with a knife, with a glove made of knives. Like, they've kind of upped the ante so much, it kind of can't work on that level. You can't horrify people with Frankenstein, because Freddy Krueger has already gone way past that horrification level, or whatever you want to call it. So I think it has to be more psychological. Now, there's a movie out now, The Invisible Man, which I actually saw the trailer. I talked about it. I like the take on it. I mean, the take of a angry divorced husband who becomes the Invisible Man and goes after his wife. I mean, that's a take. That makes him a monster. I like it because it's more psychological. However, it sort of pulls it away from, the idea of him being he's not really a hero, but, he's not a guy who meant to do this, right? Like, the idea behind a lot of these movies is scientists who play God and then go too far and, are corrupted by that in one way or another. The Invisible Man goes crazy. The Dr. Frankenstein, he plays God. He brings a guy back to life, and it's a disaster. The Mummy is just sort of a curse. The Wolfman, it's kind of a curse. And, Lon Chaney's character doesn't want to be the Wolfman. It's an accident. He goes to help somebody, and then he's cursed. The gypsy says to him, even a man who says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright. And she looks at his palm and she sees I think she sees a pentagram, if I'm not mistaken. And that, again, that was cool and creepy for its time. Like, now you'd have to go a lot further, and they've done Wolfman a million times, or werewolf-related movies, and, the effects, it's just off the charts how gory and crazy it is. And in that case, it's far removed from the Lon Chaney version, which was more character-centric. It was more about, his character trying to deal with this, which I think that model for the werewolf or the Wolfman would need to be, they need to go back to that for the Wolfman. For Frankenstein, I'm not sure what they could do. They could try going back, to this idea that, Frankenstein is playing God, and his monster is a creation that, is bad, is bad. He's just not, like they put a brain of an evil person, let's say, in the monster, who's not totally like, oh, fire, someone who's more sinister and shrewd. I think would be a good take, and I think they need to start with Frankenstein. The problem with Dracula is Dracula's kind of overexposed. He's been done so many times. So it's very difficult to get a good new take on it. Many of you may remember, and you might want to check out CB's channel the last couple of days. She's been posting Dracula versus King Arthur, the motion comic, which is very good. I mean, the comic's very good if you've never read it. Great concept. I always thought it was a super strong concept. I kick myself all the time for not coming up with it first. And that's a new take. So I'm not sure, Dracula's just been done to death. You'd probably have to go back to Vlad the Impaler and bring Dracula back as a menace, not only as a guy who drinks blood, which seems like small potatoes with today's monsters, but take him another step, that he is really just using his power and influence to do horrible things to the world. I think you could make that work. And, that not only is he Dracula the monster who drinks blood and lives forever, but he's also this international manipulator who, who's been around hundreds of years, and because of that, he controls many things, and he has undue influence, and he uses that to keep humans fighting each other, so he creates situations where he can feed, and it's not an issue. Then the addition would be to add to that not only does he create that, he doesn't really need to, and he knows that. But he's just such an evil effer. This would be a modern take, obviously. So you could have, a smarter Frankenstein, a more internationally powerful Dracula, probably a more tortured Wolfman, I would say. You'd have to go back to that. I think that's a good take. As for the Invisible Man, I'm not sure where you could go with him. If you did, say, Jekyll and Hyde first, you could maybe tie it into him as one of his associates working on something, maybe his friend that tries to talk him out of the Jekyll and Hyde formula, and but then he himself, goes off in another direction and corrupts himself. It's a tough. The Invisible Man's kind of a weak concept overall. I think it doesn't make for a great movie. You might have to jam it in with another movie, like Jekyll and Hyde. Although I'm not sure how you would build that. Jekyll and Hyde and the Invisible Man. I mean, be a lot on the marquee, or as a title. The Mummy too it's tough, but it's simple at the same. The reason it's tough is it's a very simple concept. The mummy's cursed, and if you disturb the mummy's rest, bad things happen. The problem is, I think, the Tom Cruise version of the movie. First, there was no reason to make the mummy female. It didn't really make any sense to me. But the Brendan Fraser mummy movie seemed to be mostly on point. So if I was going to build on something, I would build on that. I would get the rights to those mummy movies, bring back Brendan Fraser as an old man, and tie it in, and then bring back the mummy, or one of the mummies from those movies, and use Fraser's sort of high profile stature in that world to sell it to an audience who would love to see Fraser come back, even though he'd be he'd be a decrepit old man by this point if it was in the modern day, or you could make it one of his descendants, let's say, and Then, the crossovers, Dracula versus Frankenstein. I mean, maybe you could start with that since these movies have been around so long. That could be an interesting, you know, start. You could Dracula versus the Wolfman. Um, you could just start it there, and because Dracula's been around, and maybe you don't have to do a separate Dracula movie. Um, just jump right into it. Uh, I I like the versus concept. I've always liked, Godzilla versus Rodan and that kind of stuff. Um, King Kong, they're kind of setting up for a King Kong versus Godzilla at some point. Um, I would love to see a King Kong versus the Wolfman. Where like the Wolfman drinks a magic potion, it makes him really big, and they fight it out. Something like that be fun. Um, but for these crazy monster movies, you have to suspend your disbelief. But at the same time, you got to make them new, which is the challenge. You got to make them appeal to current audiences. And I think the King Kong movie was pretty successful on that front. But tying it in to something necessarily, it's tough. It's tough. I think you need to start. The first thing you need to start is with a hit movie. And that's why I think The Mummy is probably your best bet. By starting with The Mummy, you're already starting with a movie that was a huge hit. Everybody remembers. There were sequels. It's even though it may be too light of a movie, you could now darken it up. Now that's later, and Brendan Fraser is old. He'd probably die in that movie. Um, his character, obviously. And, I think that would be a good way to start it. So I would start with The Mummy and sort of branch out from there. Because I think the history is very important with these monsters, because they're supposed to be ancient evil, and that helps validate them to some degree. And, and then I would do the sequels like the Universal guys did, tie it right in, and start the next movie. The Fast and Furious had a ton of sequels, right? And they're not going to, sometimes they'll start it 10 years later or whatever. They played around with the timeline in that, I understand. But I would start it like right after next shot. Because that's fun. That's fun for audiences. It's a reason they go see these movies. And now that things are more of a binge-watchy atmosphere where you watch stuff on Netflix, that's even more relevant. So it's more like, instead of watching a series, you're watching, every year you're watching a new giant episode of a bigger show. So that's my screenwriter fix for the Universal Monster movies. Check out my books, Woke Stand a Novel and The Pineys, available at Amazon.com, and check out the Webcomic Factory at thewebcomicfactory.com. Today's comic is Lester Crenshaw is Still Dead. Could be a Universal Monster movie right there. It's about a comic book geek who gets turned into a vampire, and in this story, he has to fight a ghost. So we're up to the ghost fighting scene. We're almost to the end of the book. We've been posting it for 90 weeks, 94 weeks. Not in a row, because there was a stoppage. But now we're back, and we're down the last 10, 12 pages. So get on board with Lester Crenshaw is Still Dead.